I'm Robert Bean, and this is Focus, Purpose and Leadership. I decided to create this podcast because in my 40-year career in the advertising and brand strategy worlds, I've come to learn about the fundamental importance of clarity and purpose, or in my terms, the value of having a single organising principle, one that influences a business's culture, its products and services, and its reputation. In this series, I'll be chatting with CEOs and leaders who have put it into practice whilst developing their own successful businesses. In this episode, I talked to William Kendall, farmer, investor and serial entrepreneur. As managing director, William developed and ultimately sold new Covent Garden Soup Company and went on to discover, develop and sell Green and Black's chocolates. He's now working on his farm and on his latest venture, the range of premium soft drinks Cawston Press. As you'll hear, he's a man of many parts, and he's previously told me he's still not sure what he wants to do when he grows up. I was interested to read the fact that you had, why does the word dallied come into mind, but you had dallied with the law and with military and ultimately with investment banking before becoming this now famous serial entrepreneur. And I'm interested to understand if the investment banking bit was the bridge from military and law to commerce. Was that how it started?
I don't think so. I mean, I think I'm. It's an interesting question, and I think about, and I ask people a lot about what formed them. I started life as a farmer, and I'm still a farmer, but, I grew up in a farming business, and I think that taught me something. I think farmers are, they're hardworking, they're stubborn, they're persistent, they're mean, they don't have any money. So on the whole, they tend to be resourceful. So I think it sort of teaches you a sense of can do. So I think that's the starting point. I think, joining the army, I did a sort of very quick spell in the army. I did a month at Sandhurst, and then you become a platoon commander, and it was all a bit embarrassing really, because I didn't know a great deal, and I was there with 30 people, and it was incredibly indulgent of the army to allow some of us to do it. They did it every year. But it taught me about leadership. I mean, the one thing you do in Sandhurst if you're only there for 3.5 weeks is just leadership. I mean, you learn how to clean your shoes and iron your shirt and all of that, but that's all fast track, but it's all about leadership. And I suppose, growing up on a farm, your dad's the boss, so that taught me a bit about leadership. I didn't realise it was about leadership. And then having it played back to you in a place where leadership is the main subject, you start thinking about it. And you start, especially when you're arriving in an organisation which has got some serious professionals operating, and you've done 3.5 weeks and you're in charge of them, you think quite hard about leadership, and you learn from the school of hard knocks that if you march in there and say, I'm the boss, there are a lot of people there to trip you up. The bar, the law taught me about thinking straight, about good arguments, about, in advocacy, it's all about making one good argument really, really well. I think before that, it was all about showing off. If you're writing an essay at university and showing you've got 10 reasons why, the Spanish Empire declined. Well, actually, the bar it doesn't really matter about the other 9. Let's talk about the one and make a really good point.
And seventhly.
Exactly. So I think that, and then the city was sort of, the city was the real world. I mean, it's a mad world, and that's why I left it very quickly. But actually, it was a real, it was kind of, you learned about everything. You learned about all business. You learned about, the shorthand. You learned about the markets. But most of all, I learned that I couldn't work in an environment where, the product wasn't really of any great value. I mean, there is a value to doing these jobs in the city, but they're less valuable than the man who keeps the pumps going in the water business. And yet it's sort of given huge status by our society. I just found that the idea of doing that for very long just kind of appalled me, disgusted me really. So I ran from it, and I suppose because of that, and at a time when everybody else was running towards the city, and I went to business school, and everybody went to business school so they could get into the City of London. I was there with Italians, French, Germans, all much cleverer than me, all trying to work in the City of London, and I tried it and was running away from it. I kind of was running out of options, and realised that I wanted to work in somewhere that sort of borrowed from all of the experience that I had before. I wanted to be somewhere, not necessarily running them, but certainly at the table where the decisions were made, which hadn't happened in my job in the city. And I wanted to be somewhere where, leadership when you're a young person counts. And I wanted to have a product that made a difference, and I loved food from farming, and so I ended up in Covent. There it was,
yeah. But it must have been when you first got there, tiny, wasn't it?
Oh, it's tiny. Yeah. It was tiny, and it was very. It was chaotic. Of course, I didn't know it was chaotic. It just looked like a fantastic sort of schoolboy project, when everyone was running around so enthused. I mean, I knew I'd arrived in the right place because everyone was just so excited about it. I mean, I didn't want to go home for the first year I was there. It was just so exciting.
Fun, yeah.
And unfortunately, I wasn't married at the time, didn't have children, so there was no particular reason to go home. So we worked very long hours. I'm not sure how productively, but we worked very, very long hours because we knew it was going to work. I mean, I look at it now and there was no real grounds to believe it was going to work other than the product was fabulous. But
well, that's a start.
Yeah, sorry, that's, I didn't want to be too dismissive about that, but I wasn't I? Yeah, the product was fantastic. Yeah. I mean, it got better, but it was fantastic.
One of my memories of that time, because that is, after all, where we first met, and you've just mentioned, actually, the enthusiasm, was the self-definition of the company there as being enthusiastic cooks, not, I forget whether it was trained chefs or any kind of other chefs, but it was very much about being enthusiastic cooks. And it did have that wonderful energy, didn't it, of people rolling their sleeves up, getting stuck in large vats, and experimentation and excitement, and anything's possible. I don't think we'd ever seen anything quite like it.
Well, I think you're right. You remember well, and you remind me. But there were everything. We were quite. It was we were quite democratic. I mean, now everyone worries about sort of, the growing hatred of corporates and at the time that was less of an issue. But it probably wasn't in the world of food. People were beginning to be suspicious. There were, we'd had a succession, and we were to have even more food scandals. So I think being real people who sounded more like, a customer than a producer was quite important, and it helps when it's genuine. And we were just that. We were people who loved food and had come up with an idea, or someone else had come up with, but we'd found an idea, and we sort of coalesced around that. And we said, we had this wonderful test, which in a way is quite elitist, which was, do we release a batch of soup, which is, would you serve this for your friends for dinner tonight? So sometimes the factory produced chunky carrot soup, and the carrot and coriander wasn't to spec, but we tasted it and thought, well, it tastes delicious. And, it's just like you would do at home. It hasn't gone anything like the plan, but actually tastes good, and your friends are coming. So we would release it, and we'd sell it, and the supermarket would say, what are you doing? This isn't anything like the stuff you showed us. And but it tastes great. So we did that, and we would have dispatch bites running around London late at night when we were all off at, friends or in the pub, because these things would happen, and we would, I remember sitting in a pub and pouring out 2 cartons of soup because they wanted to know whether we could release it. It was very exciting. It was very sort of immediate, the whole thing. And the same with product development, and which sounds very corporate. So, when we were coming up with new ideas, they were, we were trawling our mum's cookbooks and our granny's cookbooks, and, there was a great one which you turned into an advert with Nina Bard, who was our credit controller, I think, and she turned up every day, and she had this delicious soup, and it was clearly, it was an Indian. She'd come from the subcontinent, or her parents had, and it was a delicious smelling soup, and she produced it every day. And one day, someone plucked up courage and said, "Could they try some?" Completely delicious. What's the recipe? She had no idea what the recipe was, so we had to go home with her, and because she made it every morning or every night, and she had to sort of put it all together from her head. Brilliant. And that became one of our great sellers, and it became a great ad.
So that was 9 years there.
Yeah.
And sold to Daniels PLC, and I remember all that time.
Yeah.
The motivations behind selling it, I mean, beyond the obvious motivations, but the timing behind selling it, was there anything significant there?
I think we were finding it quite difficult to imagine where to go next. We had got it up to a certain level. It had been really difficult. You know, we'd had every headwind, partly our own inexperience initially, but then just market headwind. We'd had bad luck. Maybe, you know, we'd had things like factory fires. We'd had an extortionist trying to really close the whole business. We're not trying to close the business down, but, you know, there was a danger of that happening. So we were feeling quite bruised by the end of it, and growth was beginning to slow. New products didn't seem to be working quite as well as the core products. So, and we had shareholders who'd been in for a long time. I was there for 9 years, but some of our shareholders had been in for longer. We had an institutional shareholder who, to be fair on them, was not putting us under pressure to sell, but we always knew that was how they worked. And I think we felt it was a good time to go to the market. We've been courted by various organisations over the years who said, you know, if ever we wanted to sell. I think personally as well, we were, you know, what age was I? I was in my 30s, and you know, unless you're going to run a business forever, and we weren't going to run that business forever because we owned a relatively small part of it, you're probably defined by taking a business either from the start or near the start, as we had in that case, turned it round, turned it into, you know, great success at the time, and exited it and returned the money with profits to the shareholders. It seemed like a sort of good thing to do, but I'm probably post-rationalising it.
Cycle.
Yeah. And I'm not sure, you know, looking back on it, could we have done something else? Yes, we could have. You know, it was that we were at the beginnings of the age of ready meals, of you know, and there were businesses that were not a dissimilar size from us at the time. I'm on the board of one now, and it turns over 1.3 billion. So we could have rolled the dice again and done some really exciting stuff. But
I always thought, and I mean, part of the reason for the question was there was something about the new Covent Garden Soup Company brand that, to my mind, was somehow slightly underexploited. And of course, the word soup in that name would suggest that it might needed to have been pegged back to guess what soups. But I'm not sure that was the case. I mean, the Covent Garden something else company could have been, you know, because it stood for so many other things beyond. I mean, some of the things we're talking about. You know, sort of a natural, enthusiastic goodness and all the rest of it. And when it was sold, I did wonder what Daniels might do with it beyond more variants and more facings. Not sure it's really even flown quite much more than 30,000 feet, is it?
It's there, and it's much bigger. I don't think it's gone beyond soup. I mean, I think it became the new Covent Garden Food Company at some point. But you're right. All those wider values, which were very resonant with a growing section of the public, and even more so today, could easily have been developed into new products and into new activities.
That was in 98, I think. So I mean, it was in that sense ahead of its time. But all those natural good things were hardly a faddish thing, were they? I mean, they've been around forever. It's just a matter of how they're exploited. Yeah,
but they were changing. It was evolving, and I think we were in touch because, you know, we went on to do an organic business, and one of the reasons we went on to do an organic business was that we were finding that more and more of our customers were talking about organics. In fact, towards the end, we thought, well, shall we do an organic range? And we got the feedback, and you'll probably remember this, which is we thought you were organic already, which was both good news and bad news.
No, exactly. Shock, horror.
So don't expect to charge more for something that we thought we were already getting.
What now? Stymied. Well, let's move on to that then, because that's a natural segue. Now, I want to test your memory, because mine was you turning up at our offices in Regent Street, as it was at the time, with Craig Sams. And my version of the story was that you had bought the Whole Earth Food Company. Craig had founded it. He was a pioneer in organic and all sorts of other good things. And you turned up with 2 suitcases full of products. And we did have quite a large board table, and my memory of it is this thing was covered. And you stood at one end and looked at me and said, "Rob, well, which ones of these should we keep?" And the three of us then rummaged around. And after a bit of, based on no more than judgment or anything else, I seem to remember we put the cornflakes to one side and the peanut butter to one side. And right towards the end, somebody picked this bar of chocolate up and said, "What's this green and blacks thing that's lying in this pile of other Whole Earth foods?" kind of take it from there. Do you not remember that? I mean,
I remember. Obviously, I remember the meeting, and you describe it very well. And whether it was the cornflakes or the
peanut butter,
who knows?
But,
I mean, but we had met Craig. We'd met him as part of a sort of wider journey of discovery, looking for something to do next. I mean, Nick and I. Nick was my finance partner at the time, or remains so. We'd sold Covent Garden, and we found ourselves in an office which someone had lent us, and with an old-fashioned telephone on the desk, and it didn't ring. And so we went down to Pronto Print and got some cards printed, Kendall and Beer, job too small. So we were kind of feeling quite flush with cash from having sold the business, but not a clue what to do with the rest of our lives. And all of our contemporaries were busy, working very, very hard in their 30s.
In the city or wherever.
So we went and had lots of conversations, and I went to a supper party with a friend and met a whole load of people, including Craig. And Craig said, it's odd, I've been doing this organic thing for 30 years and no one's shown any interest at all, apart from a few health food shops. And then suddenly everyone's all over me. And yet I don't seem to be making any money out of it. So long and short of it, we worked out that Craig was, a brilliant visionary, but running a business was not his best suit. And so we bought the business. We knew the chocolate was in there, and it was a separate brand. And we were excited by all of them, but I think we knew, partly because the chocolate was making more money. It was more that we knew that was the one we probably should be sticking to. But of course, what happens when you acquire a whole new family? You start dealing with the problem children first. So all of those things that you remember on the table were tantalisingly exciting. What we should have done if we'd been classically trained at McKinsey is dumped them all and got stuck into green and black straight away, because all of the financials back that up. But
but that's kind of what happened in time.
Well, it
wasn't
is,
it?
but we given that we have been to business school and all of that, it took us several years to get there.
Well, I'm sure after
quite
the
a lot
event,
of cornflakes,
all is forgiven. But I think my head was turned at the time, because it's interesting hearing you were looking into organic and wanted to ride that tide. And here was this company that's what it stood for, called Whole Earth, with this whole array of products. And on the face of it, it would have made sense to have done something with the Whole Earth brand, and the products coming from it could be sorted out later. But actually what's happened, of course, is all that's sort of gone by the by. And this little thing, and of course you were aware of it, but it was an odd one out, because it wasn't called Whole Earth and it was called Green and Black. That's the one that went on to become this colossal success. It's sort of strange.
Well, yeah, it is, but it was a beautifully conceived brand in a sector that was crying out for innovation and for what we could do to it. So I don't think it was that surprising. It was smaller than Whole Earth. It was newer than Whole Earth. It had many of the same values because it was owned by the same person. I mean, the only reason it had a separate brand is that Craig had set this rule that, sugar is a poison. As I said, he was a visionary, and, it turns out we all know now that sugar is not good for us. But, he was there 30 years beforehand, and his wife very wisely said, well, if you make chocolate and don't put any sugar in it, it'll taste disgusting. So he had to create a separate brand to make the chocolate. But that was the only reason he had a separate brand. Otherwise, it was all going to be part of the same portfolio, and it was treated as such. So it took a while before they sort of diverged, and we ran them all together. They were both great brands, and we just didn't have the resource at the time to run them both. But again, I look back on it and thought, well, we could have made the resource. We just didn't, think our way through it. So we decided to sell one.
And the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah.
So that eventually, I think in 2005, was sold to Cadbury.
Cadbury, yeah. We'd sold Whole Earth.
Sold Whole Earth.
To 3 years beforehand to somebody else, to the Sun.
And when that exchange took place, what ongoing role did you have with?
Well, I remained a non-executive director, so I'd been chief executive up to that point. And I stepped back from doing that role. Cadbury put somebody in to do the chief executive job from within their organisation. And I was there really to stop them, and I mean, this their words, not mine, but to stop them doing something stupid. I mean, they were very, very anxious that they bought this jewel that had a whole load of values which perhaps, they, a big multi-billion corporate,
didn't have,
didn't have. I mean, we'd say they did have. I mean, we would have said they'd invented them 100 years beforehand, but they felt quite vulnerable about being accused by others of sort of buying this thing and trying to snuff it out, and so they wanted to ensure that the opposite happened. And so my job, as well as just being a general non-executive director, was to call out behaviour that looked like it might threaten.
Be the guardian.
Success, be the guardian, and I and one other colleague remained involved doing that for 5 years. And
it's just history is littered, isn't it, of those examples of these heart companies, as it were, being bought by these giant corporates, and time and again one worries for them. I mean, what do you think about Innocent and what they've done? That one seems to me to have taken okay, actually. Innocent continue to be big and strong and powerful and sort of as true to themselves, it seems like, as they ever were, aren't they?
I think so. I mean, maybe they've lost some of their sort of, sparky, joyful sort of youth, but I mean, they've been around a long time. And I think because the statistics suggest that, more often than not, the business is damaged by the change of ownership, I think these big businesses have worked out that they need to do it better. When I talk to big companies these days, and I work for some of them, they're much more humble about all of this. They're very wary of it. The biggest danger in a way is that they go too far the other way, which is sort of what Cadbury did with us, which was that, there was so much respect for the brand that they failed to exploit the benefits of being part of a big family.
I did read somewhere that you're reputed to have said that you regretted selling to them.
Yeah.
But correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the real interpretation of that was more about, again, what we were talking about was whether it was the perfect time, whether there was more to be had from Green, rather than selling to Cadbury's per se. Was that really the point?
I regret the fact that we sold it too early because it was storming away, but we made that decision several years before we did sell it, and so we had little choice. But it was, we never believed it would do as well as it did, even though our business plan said it was going to do as well as it did. And I think there is something about entrepreneurs who, ignore the advice of their friends and family who tell them that this great new idea or this little product that's lying on the desk before them is never going to work. And you believe in it, you believe. And just at that point when all of those same friends say, you were right, I can't believe it, it's everywhere, you suddenly get this wall of doubt. And it's probably about having all or too many of your eggs in one basket, and you suddenly get very risk averse, just when actually the rational entrepreneurs will be saying, you were right. And I see that again and again.
That's interesting.
And so you have a sort of overwhelming desire to de-risk. And you need somebody to say, no, guys, we're going to go for it now. We're really, really well set. But I
was very amused by the attendant story that came from that original one about you talking to a German businessman, having explained that you'd sold the business, and his reaction was, "Well, why? Were you ill?" Which seemed to me to be highly exemplary of their attitude to a different thing.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm, it was a true story. I mean, It was a very, very off-the-cuff, genuine remark. He could not think of any... I mean, I had been telling him for about 10 minutes beforehand about this great business that I had been involved with and everything about it and getting all dewy-eyed about it. And, it was his only rational explanation that why would you get out of it?
Well, but just going back a step then, what values were there in the Green and Black's brand, given their proximity, its proximity to the founder, as exactly as you're saying, Covent Garden Soup Company was close to the founders as well. But in Green and Black's case, what values were there that you think could survive the now overtaken Cadburys and still, like those strong little weeds that find their way up through paving stone cracks? There must have been really profound value beyond it being an organic product that made it fly so high and ultimately will make it survive even in that sort of environment.
Well, I mean, you always come back to product and taste and delivering what the customer is looking for. It was it is an extraordinarily delicious chocolate. And there are lots of people who've come out with other chocolates at the same price point, some at heroically higher price points. And some of them are pretty good, but some of them may be almost as good as Green and Blacks. But actually, for the amount you pay, it is an amazingly delicious chocolate. And it looks beautiful. The branding has survived. But there were other aspects to the brand. It was a fantastic platform to communicate broader societal issues around business and around, relationship with the community, a relationship with your suppliers. We didn't just put a stamp of fair trade on it. I mean, we were the original UK fair trade product, but we were totally engaged with our cacao farmers in Belize and then latterly the Dominican Republic. We knew who they were, we knew where they lived, we'd been to see them, we knew their families. We weren't going to let them down, and people like that.
Is that still in existence? Do you know?
As far as I know, you don't hear about it as much, but as far as I know, and even if it's been watered down, I'm sure it's been copied by others, and so it's been a force for good. We told the story because we knew there were lots of customers out there who wanted to hear the story. They wanted to feel good. I mean, chocolate is not, you don't need to eat chocolate. So actually eating something that tastes delicious and which delivers a benefit, I mean, what's not to like about that?
And with a fantastic backstory that was very timely. So moving on then, there's a gap, isn't there, after that, before Cawston Press sort of becomes your next, as it were, branded project, as I understand. There was a gap, which we might come back to. But perhaps we could just do a little bit about Cawston. And one of the things that struck me about all three of these, it may seem like a slightly banal thing, but I don't think it is the packaging of Covent Garden Soup in the milk carton. A great bit of semiotic signalling, this is fresh. Green and Black led the charge in elegant mass package, beautiful packaging. Leave aside the backstory. And now Cawston, which I think again is another sensational bit of packaging. How much were you weaving packaging into the equation from the start, or when you look back, do you find actually we did it well 3 times, but it's become even more important than I thought it was?
Well, I think we were always weaving it. It always was vitally important because we've always had businesses where we've had very, very little money to spend on marketing. And so we've spent what little we had on the things that we thought really mattered. So, I mean, it is the point that the customer encounters you for the first time. And obviously they've got to get beyond the packaging to the product. So, yes, it's been critically important for us. I can't imagine it not being. I mean, we took on Cawston Press. It was called Cawston Vale, in fact, and the product was brilliant. That's why we got involved. But the packaging was woeful. It didn't represent what was inside it. It just looked like every other juice, and yet they were trying to charge a premium for it, which it deserved because it was much better. So it kind of follows. So it's not. I don't think it's not very insightful to say you need something very special in the packaging. It's then how do you actually do that? And I guess we've been quite good at it because we've always had people in the team who really care about design, probably more so than they might in a typical consumer good business, and who've been at the top table, who won't let second best pass, who've got quite sort of clear, visual
aesthetic
and vocabulary themselves, so they're able to, if not design it themselves, because we've always worked with partners, as you know, but have been able to write a brief in a way that a design partner gets it. And so often when I see design briefs from other businesses, they're quite, well, they give perhaps too much scope for the designer to indulge their fantasies or what they think their latest award ought to be given for, rather than actually responding to the brief. We know a lot about the business and the product by the time we get to brief.
And so when you brief in that context, then how much work do you do, and what store do you place by becoming razor sharp? I mean, I might call it a single organising principle, but lots of people have got a proposition, but I mean a sharp brand proposition that is, I think, the prelude to a design or any other sort of brief. Do you put a lot of time, energy, money, value in that stuff?
Well, we don't put a lot of money because we never have any, but we put a lot of...
It's all relative.
It's all relative. So, yeah, we put a lot of the very little money that we have got into it, and we put a lot of time, and we put a lot of brain power, and maybe that's something that, because we tend to have, nowadays we've got a reasonable amount of experience, that we can deploy. You're part of it. We bring as many conversations to bear onto that brief before we go down that route, and as in most cases, and certainly the conversations we're talking about, we're dealing with an existing business, an existing product. We've already got some data, we've already got people who are buying it. We can have some quite meaningful conversations, which you can't if you're doing a startup. So if you're doing a startup, I mean, that gives you more scope in some respects, but it also
there's so many limitations.
So in each of the cases we've been talking about, by the time we as a team have got involved, there's quite a lot of data there to work on, and quite a lot of passionate customers who you can talk to.
This market, Cawston's market's tougher though, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
It doesn't. You haven't quite got the tidal rise of organic that Green and Black had. I don't know about the sort of enthusiastic cooks at Covent Garden Soup, but there was something original, new, different, unique about them. This is much tougher.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. You're right. I mean, the Covent Garden, there was a new wave of young professionals. I think probably, the first generation, and we were part of it, of, couples where both were working equally. So time was poor. People put a lot of value on what they ate for the first time in a generation, but they had no time to do anything about it. So there were lots of things that
remember then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you're right. I mean, there are lots of areas in soft drinks where you can see niches where you might establish yourself. And look at Fever Tree, who'd have predicted that? But, well, they did, and they've delivered it. So, I mean, the thing about the soft drinks industry is it is global. And so it's very appealing for entrepreneurs to get into it, because if you get beyond a certain level, it can be huge. And so you don't have this issue of having to start again every time you go to a new country. But it is harder to find, as you say, a sort of defining principle which sets you apart massively from everybody else. That said, and it's taken us 10 years since we got involved, or nearly 10 years. The whole sugar debate in the UK, which is, of course, going on in all other Western countries, in fact, all other countries, really. The sugar debate has worked in our favour, in that we were already a business that believed very strongly that taste shouldn't be masked by too much sweetness, and that our customers were typically people who enjoyed a glass of wine or beer or whatever, but were looking for alternatives. So we were looking for an alcohol replacement a lot of the time, and they were feeling very short-changed, because you go into a lovely modern pub and everything was delicious until you got to the soft drinks, which was just
so disappointing,
incredibly sweet. And yet you think, well, if I wasn't driving, I'd be having a glass of dry white wine. So why do they assume I want something that's 4 or 5 times sweeter than that? So given how big it was, and given how smart the people were doing soft drinks, you kind of wondered why they were so inept at understanding where this fast-growing, very valuable customer segment were going to buy their drink. So, it's given us... And the sugar thing's really taken off in the UK now, and we've got a sugar tax. We responded to the sugar tax for us in a very expensive way, in that we've added more juice, which has meant that we no longer have to pay the sugar levy. And so we have a added sugar policy across the board in Cawston. And that has set us apart. And that has meant that, the phones have been ringing almost constantly since last April, when it came in, from people who didn't return our calls up until then.
Interesting,
So
isn't it?
you know, okay, it's taken us 9 years, perhaps being a little bit braver about something we always believed in, and also, you know, a change in policy at from the regulator.
Yeah, well, that presents its own opportunities. As you say. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things I think about Cawston is the distribution strategy. It really is every nook and cranny. I mean, I found it in golf clubs and corner shops. I mean, leave aside all the big. I mean, it's extraordinary how it's permeated nooks and crannies. In fact, I think that was part of what the strategy was called, was it?
Well, it was. I mean, we realised quite. I mean, it's because drinks are very different from food, and so, you know, in our previous two brands that we've been talking about, the main strategy was around the supermarkets, around the multiples, and then everything sort of flowed from there. I mean, we had wholesale customers, we had health food shops with Green and Blacks who were early adopters of it, but on the whole, it was about the supermarkets. The supermarkets don't actually sell a lot of drinks, and the soft drinks, and those that they do are sold on deal at Christmas and whatever. So, you know, they're a very important customer. But
you've got to
you've really got to get to all the other places, and so we have spent a lot on shoe leather. I can't pretend that, you know, a member of our staff has been to every golf club you're talking about, but we've sort of we facilitated it. We've made it. I don't know what it was that got that golf club to stock it, but it's probably, you know, us having a very close conversation with a wholesaler and giving them the means to reach that golf club, and then once it's there, it's established. And it's taken us a long time.
Well, just going back then, so one other observation about all three of them is that you have been able to pull off this trick of, I mean, I might call it mass niche, where they're all premium brands, all high-quality products, charged at not silly prices, but premium, and yet in very wide and mass distribution. I mean, they're very everyday. You know, there's nobody that hasn't heard of Green and Black. Very few have never heard of Covent Garden Soup. Possibly a few less with Cawston, but still,
that's changing.
That's changing, and it's everywhere. It's quite something, really, to be able to pull off that apparent contradiction. What's your take on that? How's that been?
Well, I think we've chosen areas which have the capacity to go mass niche or niche mass or whatever it was you said. I talk to a lot of people who want to go into the food and drink sector, and you look at what they're doing, and they've usually got a delicious product they've made in their kitchen, and you just think this isn't ever going to get to that sort of scale. But that's not a reason not to do it. It's a reason to be cautious about how you approach it. But, you know, this is a business that, you know, in 10 or 15 years could be £1 million business. So if you want to pursue it, don't give half your shares away in the first year. Do it in a way that doesn't require a massive amount of capital injection at the start, because you may find yourself working very, very hard for a very long time for a relatively modest stake in the business. Treat it as your own, and then one day it might well become very valuable for you. So I think, you know, we've always, and I particularly, you know, I'm quite impatient. So I want to work with other people as well. I like working with a bigger team of people who are much smarter than me. So that kind of precludes a lot of businesses you might meet because they're just not big enough, or they're not going to be big enough to do that. So I suppose, you know, over time you get a sense, and you don't know, but you get a sense that you're involved in one that's got, if you play your cards right and the wind blows in the right direction for you, it could get to that sort of size. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, bottom line to certainly those three, but it's a truism generally, isn't it, that the product's got to stand up to scrutiny. I mean, that is not quite the beginning and end of it, certainly the beginning of it. Right, well, just to finish then, William, I want to just go back to that gap then, and in particular the farm. And I remember being on it, and I remember you trying to explain to me this particular strand of wheat, I think, that hadn't been seen since Saxon times or whatever it was. Are you still doing much of that, sort of, how might I call it, esoteric farming?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a, you know, as I said, as we started, I'm a farmer. I grew up as a farmer. it's where my heart is. It's the most important thing that we do as humans. It's how we feed ourselves, and I feel very strongly that we've got a lot of things wrong about farming in the last few generations, really since the last war. And what we're doing on our farm in Suffolk, and it's not a big farm, is trying to sort of experiment and prove that you can do things differently. And it is an experiment, and a lot of people come along and say, well, is it profitable? And, I say, well, nearly, and sometimes it's not so nearly. But I mean, it's we're setting it an impossible task to be profitable, because we're always running yet another experiment on it. But what we're trying to do is first of all, farmers have got very bad at dealing with what the customer wants, because most farmers don't have customers, or they have trade customers. Most farmers in Britain are producing commodities.
Yeah.
They sell probably their entire year's work on the back of several lorries and get one cheque for it. That's their entire sales ledger. And so, over time, that removes you from the marketplace. I mean, it was never that way before. If I look at my forebears, they were constantly worrying about whether, such and such shop was going to take your milk. And my great granny had a whole series of carts that went around the villages and towns of East Bedfordshire, where I grew up, delivering butter and milk, and she was advertising in the local papers, and she was doing all of that. And I channel her when I think about what I'm doing. But, her successors, with the exception of me, have decided to concentrate on being very, very efficient producers, and have allowed other people to take the benefits of their hard work, and they've just become commodity producers.
But is that the reason you're saying that we've mistreated farming since the war? I mean, predominantly that we've become, as farmers, producers and factories rather than providers of things that real people need.
Well, I think so. I mean, there's probably some other elements in there. I think, the commoditisation of meat and protein production has to some extent been driven by the need to produce it at a very low cost, because you're no longer selling direct to the customer. But I think, what's happened is the customer's become much more worried about all of that, and the farmer isn't in a position to respond anymore. Because what's happened, of course, is that, to survive, the farmers have got bigger and bigger and bigger, because they're producing stuff at incredibly low margins. And so it's quite difficult to then engage in what we're doing in Suffolk, which is talking to our neighbours and selling to them again, because the farmer's saying, well, I've got a barn full of, it's got 50,000 tons of wheat. How do I sell that? And I mean, I bought a flour mill to deal with it, but I haven't got 50,000 tons of wheat to sell. So I started from scratch again and said, well, we're not going to sell anything unless we can sell it to the end customer. And so we do produce quite a lot of grain still, but we feed it to hens and we sell it as branded eggs on the farm.
And I mean, more than that, I know that the local Waitrose there has been heavily influenced by you, and they take much of your stuff, and I dare say other locals. To what extent has that caught on them? It just seems like such a brilliant idea, even just being crassly commercial on behalf of the supermarkets, the thought that they might do more of that.
Well, I mean, I think they'd love to do more of it, and not just Waitrose. I think they all would, because, their customers tell them that they want more of that. But and you're right, Waitrose have been very supportive. They've always, because they have a bigger range, and because perhaps their customers over-index on caring about the story behind the food and drink they buy. But the supermarket model in its later stages, which is the ones we're in now, doesn't really lend itself to that, because what you've described is hassle. We're in 4 Waitroses. Waitrose have got over 200, I don't know how many stores they've got, but anyway, they've got, a lot more stores than 4. Yeah. And so having to deal with me involves having somebody at head office, and it's not something that they can planogram across the estate. They have to... No. And so, good on them for doing that, and as you say, allowing lots of other small producers to come in too, and I hope it benefits them. I mean, I know we are, in our local Waitrose, we are both their best-selling egg and their most expensive one, so it certainly works superficially
Yeah,
for them. And also there's a whole, and the internet obviously provides it. There are a whole load of other channels which are doing quite well out of the public's desire to buy food with a story. So it's not necessarily the supermarkets who are going to be the beneficiary of this new wave.
No, quite. William, thank you very much for your time and for your erudite explanation of all these amazing brands that you've created and delivered to the world. And here's to your farming elbow.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
You're very welcome. Thanks again, William. Please do subscribe to the podcast in your usual podcast app to get new episodes when they're released. If you have any comments or questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. It's robert@robertbeanbranding.com. Thanks for listening.